So before I get into lecture today, I kind of just want to tell you guys a little bit about my thought process in sort of coming up with the topics that we would talk about today. So, my expertise is in cognitive psychology, which everything we've talked about up to this point has kind of fit under that umbrella. Now we're sort of starting to venture outside of that into topics that I know a little bit less about than I do about cognitive psychology. So social psych is one of those where I didn't get a PhD in this subject. Whenever I started designing this lecture, my first thought was that I would basically just copy what the textbook did. So I thought I'd go in and just go to the textbook chapter and just basically convert all that to a PowerPoint and go over it with you. And I had kind of planned on doing that up until basically yesterday. And then yesterday I started looking at my lecture notes and kind of thinking about what I was, going to talk about in more detail. And I thought this might be kind of boring for me and for you, for me to basically just recite what the textbook already says. You have the textbook, you can read it. So if you want to know what the textbook says about social psych, go there. I thought what I would do instead is, I had a lot of friends in graduate school that were in the social psychology program, and so they would tell me about things that they were doing or things they were learning in class. So I thought I would kind of highlight some of the things that I remember from that because they were interesting enough that I remember them 5 years later. So I figured that they would probably be interesting to you as well. So I kind of went and picked out some of those topics that I remembered, and that's kind of what we're going to go over today. So that's kind of the plan. Given that there's maybe less content today than I typically have, but I also feel like social psych is a subject that typically, there's things that might be a little bit more controversial or that might kind of stir up more discussion than usual. So I hope that you have lots of questions and things to talk about. If not, then this might be a really short lecture, which is completely fine with me. So we'll just kind of see how it goes. So some of the main things we're going to focus on today. First, kind of the whole idea of social psychology is that an individual person's behavior is often affected in very profound, meaningful ways by the people around them. So we don't just exist in a vacuum. We exist in a society, in all kinds of different types of social groups, and those groups affect us in all kinds of interesting ways. So we'll talk about some of those ways that groups affect us. We'll also spend a little bit of time focusing specifically on the justice system. There's a lot of research done in the area of social psychology on this topic. Some of that actually overlaps with cognitive psychology as well, so they both kind of tend to approach issues within the justice system. So we'll talk about a couple of specific instances within that. And then another thing I want to end kind of today's lecture with is talking about this issue that exists in a lot of fields, not just within psychology, really any area that does research that's scientific in nature. But social psychology in particular seems to suffer from this lack of what's called replicability. So, in general, whenever a scientist does some kind of study or research, they're going to publish that research. They should publish it in a way that other people can try to replicate what they did. Basically, try to repeat that study and see if they find the same results. And in social psychology, it turns out that if you do that, if you try to replicate the results of a lot of studies, you do not find the same results. And there are a lot of reasons why social psychology in particular is really, prone to that. So we're going to talk about some of those issues. All right. For those of you who were just kind of wondering, and make sure you come up after class and get your quiz from last time. So let's start, like I said, talking about kind of different ways that groups can impact our individual behaviors. One of these is through this concept of what's called diffusion of responsibility. So typically when we're by ourselves, we have to make a decision alone. The responsibility is 100% on our shoulders. We might sort of take that responsibility. But if we're in group settings, then that responsibility gets diffused to all the different members. And so any individual within a group might feel less responsible to act or to make certain kinds of decisions based on, being a part of a group, basically. And there's a few specific ways that this can happen. One of them is through what's called conformity. So conformity is basically where the individual tries to match their behavior to the group that they are in. This did come from your textbook, so you might have read this if you did read the chapter, but there's something called the Asch effect, which is basically where people will give a very obviously wrong answer to a question if they see people in a group, especially if it's a group that they identify with, giving that same wrong answer. So one of the first studies that showed this that Ash did, he basically had participants come into this study where there were a group of what are called Confederates. So a lot of the studies I'm going to talk about today, they use this concept of Confederates, so I just want to make sure everybody understands it. Basically, a Confederate is someone in a study who is acting like they're a participant, but in reality, they're a part of the study. They might be the researcher themselves or someone that the researcher has hired to basically act like a participant. So there's only one real participant in each group in this study. The rest of the people in the group are Confederates. So Ash just gave basically these participants really simple questions. One of them, he showed them like a line, and then he had 3 lines, and he asked them which one matched the same length. And there's one that's like really obvious. This is not a difficult task at all. It's like really obvious that one of the lines is the correct answer. But what he did is he had all the Confederates answer out loud first. And all of the Confederates gave the same incorrect answer. And then what he found is that a majority of the participants themselves would then also give the same wrong answer, even though it's obviously incorrect, if they heard, the group before them give that wrong answer. This was particularly true if he let the participant interact with the Confederates quite a bit before the actual study, to where they kind of built a little bit of rapport. The Confederates were instructed in some cases to actually try to build a similar identity, try to match whatever the participant talked about, to kind of build more cohesion within the group. Whenever they did that, the effect was even more pronounced. They had more participants that would give the incorrect answer. So that's the Ash effect. The next one I'm going to talk about, I want you to just kind of imagine a scenario to demonstrate this one. So I want you to imagine, close your eyes if you want to. Let's say that tomorrow you have a really important exam in one of your classes. This exam is going to determine your grade, if you pass or if you fail. In some class that's your major, it's really important, okay? Let's say you're on your way to that class, you're walking to campus, and you come to an intersection, and an old person in front of you collapses on the ground, and it looks like they're having a heart attack, okay? You could help this person. If you do, you're probably going to be late to your exam, but you're the only person there. There's no one else around to help. I want you to just think about, what would you do in that scenario? You don't have to tell me. I want you to just kind of think about it for a little bit. All right, so then I want you to imagine exact same scenario, except now the intersection is very busy and crowded. There's lots and lots of people all around, as many people as you can fit in an intersection in Longview. And all these people see the same thing. They see this old person collapse on the ground. Some of them just kind of rush off, ignore it. A few of them stop and stare. Maybe a couple people pull out their phone. It kind of looks like they're about to call someone. When you think in that scenario, would you do the same thing? Would you do the same thing that you would have done if you're by yourself? Research shows that the answer is probably no, that in those two situations you would act very differently. This is sometimes called the bystander effect. And the idea is that whenever you're alone and you see some sort of emergency situation, you're typically much more likely to help or to take responsibility, to call 911, to help the person or do whatever you need to do. But if there's a large group of people that all witness that same incident, then each individual within that group is much less likely to step up and take responsibility. They're a lot less likely to make a call or do anything to help the person. The first time that this was reported was this case of a person named Kenny Genovese. And I'll tell you before I even tell the story that it turns out that a lot of this story turned out to be untrue. But I'm going to tell you the story anyways, just because that's where the bystander effect originally came from. So this incident happened in the 1930s in Queens. There was this woman, Kitty Genovese, who was walking home, and she basically got assaulted by a group of men. And it was in a street that was fairly busy. There were lots of apartment complexes around where the incident happened. And the newspaper, I think it was actually the New York Times that reported this first, they reported that there was over 40 people that had witnessed the event, but that none of them called the police or did anything to help. So that was kind of the original story. It turned out later, a lot of people went back and kind of did an investigation of the event. It turned out that actually some people had tried to call the cops, but there was something wrong with the phone system. And so maybe those initial details that were reported were probably not true. But that was kind of what spurred this idea of like researching the bystander effect. And then kind of interestingly, since then, again, that was in the 1930s, there have been lots of instances of similar events where it was true that like there's a large group of people that witnesses an event and basically does nothing about it. And then there's also some social psychologists who have done actual experiments where they, again, have confederates. They have someone, like an older person, who pretends to collapse on the street. And they'll vary the amount of people who are witnessing that event. And then they'll kind of, observe like how many people actually step up and help or do anything. And again, what they consistently find, when you're alone, you're much more likely to act and help compared to if you're in a group of people. So that's the bystander effect. Another way that diffusion of responsibility can kind of rear its head in groups is what's called groupthink. So groupthink is this phenomenon where people in a group will make decisions not in a way that's like best suited to solve the problem or to, produce something, but instead they'll make decisions in order to reduce any kind of conflict. So they're trying to avoid conflict within the group, and all of their decisions are sort of based around that. One example of this was the Challenger space shuttle. So this was a space shuttle that basically exploded, killed 7 astronauts because of some engineering failures basically within the shuttle itself. And leading up to that, leading up to the launch of the shuttle, there were actually a bunch of engineers who told the leaders who were in charge of making this decision that there was something wrong. I think there was like a seal or something that wasn't connecting correctly, and the engineers knew like if we try to launch without the seal functioning, then the shuttle's going to blow up. So the engineers had communicated that to the group of the leaders, like the managers in charge of making the decision. But those leaders were more, sort of persuaded by trying to avoid conflict within their own little managerial group. So lots of those managers really, really wanted this launch to happen. There was a lot of like momentum and positive energy that had come before that to try to make it happen. And those managers often had worked together for a very long period of time, so they knew each other really well. And so they basically just wanted to avoid the conflict of saying, no, we're not going to do this launch, because it would have made a lot of people angry. So they went ahead, did it, and then the shuttle ended up exploding and killing 7 people. There's a whole report about it that you can read in more detail. If you just Google probably groupthink Challenger space shuttle, you'll find more detail than that. Okay, another example you might be familiar with if you've ever had to do a group project, here in college or in high school or any time, is this concept of social loafing. So social loafing refers to the fact that individuals in a group will often produce less than they would if they had been functioning on their own, right? So if I took any one of you and I told you, put together a presentation or something like that, the amount of time and effort that you would put into that presentation by yourself is going to be much higher than if I said, okay, I'm going to put you in a group of 4 people. Now the 4 of you work together and put this presentation together. And so people tend to, again, kind of diffuse that responsibility to other people in the group and not do as much work as they would otherwise. And then the last way I'll talk about that being in a group can affect us is this concept of de-individuation, which is kind of this idea that whenever you're in a large group, it can start to feel a little bit like you're anonymous. I'm part of this group, and so no one's really going to recognize me as an individual because I'm acting as a group. This is one of the things that can often lead to things like mobs and riots. If you think of large groups of people doing terrible things, setting buildings on fires, flipping cars, whatever, often they do that because they have this sense that I'm working in a group, and it's the group that's making these decisions, not me as an individual. And it would be hard for anyone, I'm not going to suffer consequences because I'm part of such a big group that I'm basically anonymous. So that's de-individuation. So I'll say too, a lot of these effects that I'm talking about were kind of discovered. The bystander effect, that was 1930s. A lot of these are older. I would say that now, considering the environment we have with media, internet, things like that, a lot of them are probably even more pronounced than they were at the time that they were like discovered, because the way that we form groups has changed drastically, and the types of groups we can be part of is a lot different. It used to be, before internet and everything, your groups were pretty much determined by your geographic location to some extent. Now you can be a part of a group that, you know, exists globally, basically. Did you have your hand up, Alex?
Yeah. I wanted to ask about social loafing.
Mm-hmm.
So that concept, is that more of like an academic, because you only given like an academic example of it, and I was kind of thinking that a lot of that might have to do with people not having practice in working in groups.
Yeah, so I can't think of specific examples off the top of my head, but I know that there have been some studies that take place more in like a work setting.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like I said, I can't think of like what was the specific work setting. Was it something where the people coming in are kind of like beginners, or is it more, you know, like people who have really advanced knowledge? I will say one of the things I know that affects it is kind of like the complexity of the task. Mm-hmm. So in general, if you give people a really simple task in a group, then you'll have more social loafing. Whereas if it's something really complex and challenging, it actually leads to less social loafing. But I can't remember kind of the specific details of like studies that looked at those concepts. All right. Any other questions about kind of these ways that being in a group can affect us? I'll also say too, I kind of chose, I mean, you might notice almost everything I just talked about was negative to some extent. Obviously, being in a group, having a society has tons of positive effects, right? Like we couldn't exist and have the lives that we have if we didn't have groups and societies contributing the way that we do. But I felt like, you know, those positive things are kind of obvious in some ways, and you maybe don't necessarily think about the ways that being in a group can negatively impact people's behavior.